Time's a funny thing. You see, the progression of time is all relevant to our own experiences, our own perspectives. It seems that the older we get, time rapidly increases momentum at an exponential rate. The passage of time is measured by the rotation of the planet, the changing of the seasons, and an infernal invention known as the digital alarm clock. It's also worth noting that a dude by the name of Albert Einstein once said that time doesn't even exist. It's just our perception. So, there's that. As it turns out, one thing we do know for certain is that this fourth dimension we call time flows in one direction, presumably because Father Time's a jerk. But that doesn't mean we can't look back to where we came from. In the age of Google, the ultimate source of knowledge is available to more people than ever before. Regardless, many people I encounter on a daily basis don't seem to care or are blissfully unaware of history, or current events for that matter. But rather than simply grumble to myself incoherently and shake my fist at the sky and my personal frustrations, I decided to do something about it. I started a blog, a history blog. EpicFails.com is basically a history book with nerdy pop culture references, Star Wars jokes, memes, and the occasional F-bomb. Through my work on the site over the last few years, I've learned a thing or two about the many ways in which history likes to repeat itself, over and over again. The story of mankind is one of triumph over nature, of overcoming insurmountable odds through ingenuity, and of course, learning through trial and error. Well, sometimes more error than trial. As it turns out, many of the turning points in human history were the result of catastrophic failure. In fact, we seem to have an innate ability to fail upwards against all odds, from the discovery of fire to the invention of the light bulb. Our species has nearly limitless potential, and yet, through all the incredible advances we've made in the fields of science, medicine, and the culinary art of deep-fried Twinkies, we've yet to find a way to come together as a species and tackle the real problems our world faces. It's not in failing does a person show their true worth, but in using the knowledge gained from one's mistakes to achieve true greatness. So, if making mistakes is human history, and therefore we all make mistakes, but we're supposed to learn from those mistakes, what happens when we apply this simple equation to human history? Recorded history is basically a set of guidelines what not to do. Because of this, I believe history shouldn't be romanticized, but rather criticized. Speaking of, history as we know it today began with the Greek poet Herodotus, who recorded the events of the Greek campaigns against Xerxes, albeit a little inaccurately. Sometimes great accidents can lead to world-changing discovery, like back in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered the Bahamas while searching for Japan. But for every success through failure, there's 1,000 Titanics, Hindenburgs, and Chernobyls. So what have we learned in the past 2,500 years since Herodotus first started scribbling dates in his journal and called it history? Well, for one, inequality is inefficient. It seems like a simple and obvious concept for those of us privileged enough to live in a modern Western civilization, but back in the good old Roman Empire, it seemed like a perfectly good idea to give unlimited power to a single individual. This especially became problematic when a series of psychopaths inherited the job. There's Emperor Nero, for example. He was nuttier than an extra crunchy tub of wholesale peanut butter. It's no wonder that early Christians denoted Nero as the Antichrist, deriving 666 from his numerical name. It might have had something to do with his tendency to feed them to lions. After murdering his family, burning Rome to the ground, killing thousands of innocent people, and blaming Christianity, this matricidal tyrant then went on to heavily tax the citizens of the empire to pay for his ginormous, 60-foot-tall, gold-plated statue to go in front of his ginormous palace built over the ruins of Rome. Over the course of 5 centuries and 147 emperors, only 2 of them died of natural causes. Almost all others were assassinated. Meanwhile, over in ancient Egypt, Ramses II liked to rewrite history, taking credit for the deeds of previous pharaohs by scratching out their names and writing his in its place, claiming he won battles they actually lost, thinking no one would notice. Ramses' reign led to the eventual downfall of Egypt. His name was all but forgotten for 2,000 years until archaeologists began to piece together his legacy of lies from ruins. Again and again over the centuries, dictators have risen and fallen as predictable as the tide, Vlad the Impaler, Genghis Khan, Stalin, and Ivan the Terrible, to name a few. There are still parts of this world that are ruled through fear and terror by the totalitarian regimes. North Korea, for example. So what should these men have taught us? They lived well as tyrants while humanity crumbled around them, reducing amazing civilizations to rubble, and the rest is history. Whenever you take liberty from others, it's humankind that suffers from it. Although we take it for granted, the basic premise of freedom and individual rights wouldn't even become a thing until 1215, when the Magna Carta was drafted and King John immediately attempted to undraft it. The United States was founded in 1776 on the principles of freedom, liberty, and justice to all, and as a result became a hub of innovation, precisely because of the unique opportunities this country offered. As a result, over the course of 2,000 centuries, the entire world changed. Historically, whether it's freedom of religion, women's suffrage, or civil rights, a passion for liberty changes the world for the better, whereas totalitarianism stunts growth or even reverts it. Which brings me to another lesson that history should have taught us. Even today, one factor above all others is the driving force behind suppressing the ability of lower-class citizens from bettering themselves, the great economic divide. When profits take precedence over people and the environment, there is a serious problem with the system: greed. And if history has anything to say about it, it's that greed corrupts all. Avarice, the insatiable lust for power or wealth, has caused countless armed conflicts since the beginning of time. It could easily be argued that even the semi-mythical Trojan War wasn't really about a love triangle or a quarrel of the gods, but beachfront property. Alexander the Great united one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. He conquered entire nations, bringing several dynasties under his banner. But in his self-centered conquest, he refused to name a successor, leading to the complete and total collapse of his entire kingdom within a few years of his untimely demise. Meanwhile, many a Spanish conquistador lost his life in a futile quest for a fabled city of gold in the Amazon rainforest, and the golden age of piracy was kicked off by illegally sanctioned privateers hijacking supply ships for their own greedy governments. But one of the best historical examples is probably the French Revolution. The first French Revolution in particular started as a revolt against a gluttonous monarch, primarily brought on by countrywide economic hardship and blatant disregard for the poor. In the late 1780s, the Bourbon monarchy reigned from the Palace of Versailles, a palatial estate built 20 miles outside the districts of Paris, far enough away from the stench of its open sewer system and the complaints of its commoners. This truly monstrous mansion would put every single house on MTV's Cribs to shame. Versailles was a 2,300-room, gold-plated, 67,000 square meter estate of pure unadulterated excess. Louis XVI lived in a gigantic theme park dedicated to his uselessness, while in the real world, France was simmering in a toxic combination of poverty, hunger, and dissatisfaction. Between the food shortages, increased taxes, economic crisis, and political discourse, France was one gamma-inducing incident away from hulking out. That incident came in 1789 when the third estate of government, the state representing those smelly peasants, was locked out of their own appeal to the courts after having their pleas for equal taxation of the wealthy denied. The tennis court oath was signed, and roughly the entire population of France became a swarming sea of torches and pitchforks that tore down the Bastille brick by brick and forced King Louis to sign the Declaration of the Rights of Men prior to confiscating his head. All this paved the way for the rise of a guy named Napoleon. Perhaps you've heard of him? To sum it up, Napoleon got greedy. He had the chance to end royalist rule, but was corrupted by his insatiable lust for power. I think I'm sensing a pattern here. Modern history lies in the greedy hands of corrupt corporations, political lobbyists, oil conglomerates, and even the military-industrial complex. Speaking of, huge profits have been made from the misfortunes of war by employing armies, selling guns, manufacturing supplies, and so on. The beneficiaries of these conflicts don't condemn them as mistakes and will continue to fuel them as long as they continue to profit from them. War is defined as the failure of diplomacy, meaning more armed conflicts should be avoided through diplomatic means. Unfortunately, there are those who are unwilling to start a dialogue with the perceived enemy due to cultural bias and prejudice, often based on a rigorous set of archaic ideologies that make simple negotiation nearly impossible. Which brings me to my final point. There's no fun in fundamentalism. When Hernando Cortez came to the New World, Montezuma was convinced that he was the prophesied Aztecian bird god. Suffice it to say, history might have been a little bit different if he'd been a bit more skeptical. One of the most prevalent issues of our day is this conflict between facts and parables, science and mythology, reason and superstition. At the root of this problem is fundamentalism, the unwavering adherence to a strict literal interpretation of dogmatic creed. This line of thought inherently discourages progress based on new information, willful ignorance of what can be perceived by our basic human senses, resulting in scientific denial, discrimination, and even holy wars. There is no such thing as a spiritual war. That said, the Crusades were a series of failed conquests on an epic scale. They accomplished next to nothing except leading to more problems in an already tumultuous region. The Crusades were fought over Jerusalem from 1095 to 1272, a never-ending series of medieval military campaigns in the name of the church that spanned the 11th to 13th centuries. There were a total of nine official crusades, as well as a couple of non-pope sanctioned ones. Only the first one can even be remotely considered a success, if by success you mean slaughtering 30,000 non-combatants over a plot of land. Suffice it to say, the Crusades sucked worse than an industrial-sized vacuum at the center of a black hole. Religion itself is not a bad thing. It gives hope, comfort, a way to live and shape our values. But religion mixed with politics is almost always a terrible idea. What's more is that the Torah, or the Jewish edition of the Old Testament on which all three major monotheistic religions are based, was written during a time before the concepts of science and history. It's a compilation of several metaphorical parables which draw inspiration from other cultural stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Egyptian tale of Horus. Everything we know today tells us that the Bible was never meant to be taken as a literal historical text, much less a scientific textbook. Unless, of course, you don't like penicillin, electricity, or hygiene. Because, like all stories of its time, it was weaved together from symbolic narratives, which explain things in nature. Things that couldn't be understood back then. Some things that we now have figured out thanks to science. Speaking of, the scientific method was conceived of during the Italian Renaissance, courtesy of Sir Isaac Newton and other philosophers in the 18th century. It was during this age of enlightenment that the Holy Roman Empire began the Inquisition to stomp out heretical ideas through torture, exile, and even execution. When Galileo proposed that maybe Copernicus was right about the whole Earth orbiting the sun thing, he was forced to live under house arrest for the remainder of his life. Giordano Bruno, on the other hand, was subsequently burned at the stake for his own theories, which turned out to be completely right. Today, modern fundamentalism manifests itself in the form of jihadist Taliban, stopping young women from going to school. The caste systems of India being enforced so that economic mobility is non-existent for the untouchable class. And antiquated ideals of land ownership cost the lives of generations in the Middle East. Standing up for what we believe in is one of the most powerful things we can do as a human species. But an unfailing devotion to an idea without the flexibility of compromise or progress is what makes fundamentalism more dangerous than a nuclear-amplified toxic sludge monster duking out with Godzilla in the middle of Metropolis. Ego, greed, and fundamentalism. All three of these interrelated factors have allowed the mistakes of human history to repeat on an unending loop of destruction. The most common symptom is war. Regardless of how you look at it, war is costly. It's expensive in more than just an economic sense. There are always casualties, both soldiers and civilians alike, figures that are not quantifiable by monetary means. There have been thousands of wars fought over the past 3,400 years. In fact, we've been at war for nearly 93% of our recorded history, and over 1 billion lives have been lost in the crossfires. Far too many wars are started over ego, fueled by greed, and prolonged by fundamentalism. These are lessons we should have learned years ago, but have been blind to because of sheer ignorance. Like Ramses in the Soviet Union, politicians have often attempted to rewrite history to suit their own agendas. Unfounded claims about the motivations of the Founding Fathers, misleading statistics to support a biased claim, as well as interpretations of the Bible, the Constitution, Beatles lyrics. But we can't learn from history if we're not honest about it. So why does that all matter, you ask? Well, for one, regardless of our tendency to deny it, we are living on borrowed time. For all we know, at any moment, we could be wiped out by a stray gamma ray burst, eradicated by a nuclear holocaust, obliterated by a supermassive volcanic event, or fall prey to an invasion of flying monkeys from the fifth dimension, for all we know. In other words, if we don't destroy ourselves, it's just a matter of time before the universe does us in Krypton style. For the sake of survival, we need to come together, work through our differences, and focus on building a brighter future. Education for all is the key to that future. No one can predict when our time is up. After all, there are plenty of examples of failed doomsday prophecies to back that up. But it's not an excuse to be lazy or, worse, apathetic. Once we put our differences aside and work together on the basics to end war, hunger, and poverty, we can then focus on solutions to cure cancer, extend our longevity through genetic manipulation, give birth to artificial intelligence, and then one day maybe even explore, terraform, and colonize other worlds. We need to reflect on the past and learn the lessons it has to offer. But it is equally important to look forward to the future with hope and fascination at the limitless possibilities. Plan for the future, but live in the moment, because all we really have is now. So in the meantime, be on the right side of history. Thank you.